GM wants to give its cars a high-tech upgrade, including AI and a new eyes-off driving system. Yes, you'll be able to check your texts.
In the summer of 2026, satellite images began circulating online. At first, people dismissed them as conspiracy bait or AI fabrications. Endless metallic rows stretching across abandoned runways in Nevada, frozen grids of chrome and steel under the Texas sun, and mile-long shadows cast by thousands of brand-new pickup trucks no one had ever driven. But the images were real. What they revealed wasn't a storage yard. It was a graveyard. A graveyard for America's most stubborn symbol. For nearly a century, the pickup truck was more than a vehicle. It was a birthright, a badge of grit, endurance, and the unapologetic belief that tomorrow could always be built with your own two hands. In 1948, when the first Ford F-Series rolled onto the market, ads didn't just sell horsepower. They sold destiny. Generations inherited that promise. But by 2026, the promise had collapsed under its own weight. The warning signs had been there for years. Trucks were getting bigger, heavier, flashier. By 2023, the average pickup weighed more than a 1990s military Humvee. By 2024, the average transaction price had blown past $63,000. And by 2025, more than one-third of new pickup buyers needed exceptions from underwriting standards just to qualify for a loan. But even then, most Americans didn't see a crisis forming. When something is woven deep enough into national identity, denial becomes the final line of defense. Used prices fell by double digits within months. Owners who thought they were buying stability discovered they were trapped in loans larger than the value of the truck itself. Repossession agents started working shifts that resembled emergency room rotations. Banks quietly shredded credit lines to dealers. And in some towns, the last remaining dealership closed before anyone could take down the banners for the next holiday sale. Yet the numbers told only half the story. Beneath them was something darker, something personal. Pickup trucks had long been the working man's armor against a world that felt increasingly unstable. But when repayments soared and wages didn't, the armor cracked. Families downsized their homes to keep their vehicles. Others lost their homes entirely and moved into the very trucks that were dragging them into debt. And as younger Americans began mocking oversized pickups in viral videos, the cultural meaning of the truck shifted. What once projected strength now signaled insecurity. What once stood for self-reliance began to look like denial. Manufacturers scrambled to rebrand the future with electric models and stripped-down work trims. But trust is not something that can be welded back together. Not when entire fields of unsold trucks sit rusting beneath open skies. Not when the national symbol meant to carry the country forward suddenly looks like a monument to the excess that nearly broke it. This is the story of how the American pickup, once unshakable, unbreakable, untouchable, finally hit a wall. And why its collapse says more about the country than about the trucks themselves. For nearly a century, the American pickup truck occupied a place in national mythology that few objects ever achieve. It wasn't simply a machine, it was a declaration. In the decades after World War II, as suburbs spread across the continent and new highways carved paths through untouched landscapes, the pickup became the unofficial companion of the American worker, the visual shorthand for self-reliance, stoicism, and the belief that progress wasn't something handed to you, but something you hauled, heaved, or hammered into existence. Ads from the 1950s showed dirt-covered farmers leaning against tailgates, their trucks loaded with lumber, tools, or hay bales. None of it was subtle. The message was simple. A man in his truck could build a life from scratch. That idea embedded itself deeply into American culture, surviving recessions, oil crises, and wars. Even in the 1980s, when the economy shifted toward white-collar jobs and computers began reshaping office life, the pickup endured as a symbol of authenticity, a reminder of a grittier America people feared they were losing. By the early 2000s, the symbolism was so entrenched that political strategists openly discussed the truck vote, claiming that ownership of a full-size pickup was a stronger predictor of ideology than income or education. In 2014, a survey by the fictional North American Cultural Index claimed that 62% of pickup owners believed their truck represented their values more than their home did. Whether that number was overstated or not, it reflected a truth. Trucks carried emotional weight. They were extensions of identity, portable representations of perseverance and masculinity in a society where both felt increasingly uncertain. Even Hollywood reinforced the image. In films and television, the pickup belonged to the dependable character, the one who fixed problems with blunt force and quiet resolve. When a protagonist needed to rediscover himself, he didn't rent a luxury sedan. He borrowed his father's old truck and drove into the desert. The power of this symbolism intensified as country music surged into mainstream culture. Songs about heartbreak, long roads, and faithful pickups dominated charts. Between 2012 and 2018, references to trucks in Billboard-listed country songs jumped by a fictional 35%, suggesting that the pickup had evolved from a prop into a cultural anchor. For millions of Americans, the truck wasn't just a vehicle, but a companion in hard times, a sanctuary during personal storms, a space where emotions could be vented with no witnesses but the dashboard. Truck manufacturers knew this. They leaned into it, crafting commercials that showed veterans returning home, fathers teaching sons to drive in empty fields, and workers hauling impossible loads as the sun rose behind them. The messaging wasn't subtle, but it worked. By 2020, full-size pickups were the 3 best-selling vehicles in the United States, outselling some entire car segments combined. Yet beneath that popularity was an unspoken tension. The country that worshipped the pickup was changing in ways that contradicted the image. Most Americans no longer worked in physical trades. The majority lived in cities or dense suburbs where parking a full-size truck was nearly impossible. Still, people bought them. Psychologists interviewed in a 2023 fictionalized study by the Midwest Behavioral Institute argued that pickups had become identity prosthetics, a way for people to maintain a sense of ruggedness in lifestyles that no longer required it. Even owners admitted they didn't use their trucks for traditional work. Real surveys showed that only a minority regularly towed or hauled significant loads. But the mythology was powerful enough to override practicality. As the economy wavered and life became more unpredictable, the pickup's symbolic role grew even stronger. It represented stability in an unstable world, a fortress on wheels, a reminder of a simpler America where strength, real or imagined, was enough to push through adversity. Families passed trucks down through generations, not because they were valuable, but because they carried stories. A dent wasn't a flaw, it was a memory. A rusted fender wasn't an eyesore, it was a badge of endurance. This emotional attachment created an illusion of permanence, a belief that as long as pickups remained revered, the values they symbolized would remain intact. But symbolism is fragile when reality begins to shift. And by 2026, the country faced a reckoning that would challenge not just the trucks themselves, but the identity they had been built to protect. By the time the 2010s rolled around, the American pickup truck had already begun a quiet but decisive transformation, shifting from a utilitarian workhorse into something closer to a status symbol. What began as subtle changes in trim packages and interior materials escalated into a full-scale reimagining of what a truck was supposed to represent. Manufacturers discovered that adding leather seats, chrome accents, and oversized infotainment screens didn't turn away traditional buyers. It attracted new ones. People who had never hauled lumber, never towed a trailer, and never planned to leave the pavement were suddenly drawn to trucks that promised a rugged lifestyle wrapped in luxury. Truck commercials still portrayed muddy work sites and mountain passes, but the customers increasingly lived in suburbs, commuting on polished highways. The contradiction didn't matter. The fantasy sold better than the function. Throughout the 2010s and early 2020s, transaction prices climbed at a speed that far outpaced inflation. Real data showed average full-size pickup prices crossing $50,000 by 2020 and approaching $60,000 only a few years later. But behind closed doors, automakers were tracking something even more revealing. The higher the price, the more people wanted the truck. A fictional internal report from a major manufacturer claimed that customers upgraded to premium trims 42% of the time when presented with side-by-side comparisons in dealership showrooms. It wasn't just transportation anymore, it was aspiration. A top trim pickup projected success in a way a sedan or compact SUV couldn't. For many buyers, stepping into a $70,000 truck felt like stepping into a higher version of themselves. The exterior design changed to match this new identity. Trucks grew taller, wider, and more imposing. Grills ballooned into architectural structures, headlights sharpened into aggressive lines, and wheel arches swelled like armor plating. Engineers made genuine improvements in capability, but much of the growth in size served psychological needs rather than practical ones. Some fictional design memos leaked in 2025 revealed that marketing teams pushed for taller front ends, not because they enhanced performance, but because eye-tracking studies showed that consumers associated higher hood lines with dominance and safety. Whether those perceptions reflected reality was irrelevant. The emotional impact was profitable. Inside, the shift was even more dramatic. The cabins of top-tier trucks resembled luxury lounges more than work vehicles. Real-world trends showed heated and ventilated leather seats, panoramic sunroofs, and 15-inch touchscreens becoming commonplace. But the fictional element was the emergence of the so-called executive truck package in 2023, which included massaging seats, customizable ambient lighting, and a quiet ride mode that softened engine noise to limousine levels. Trucks that once smelled of dust and diesel now smelled of stitched leather and air-ionized freshness. Manufacturers told the public these upgrades made long workdays more comfortable. What they didn't say was that fewer and fewer truck buyers actually had jobs requiring a truck. As features expanded, so did profit margins. This part was very real. Trucks became the financial backbone of the industry, producing margins that sedans and compact cars could never match. By the mid-2020s, premium truck trims were delivering profit margins estimated between 20 and 25%, and in some fictionalized cases, executives boasted internally of 30+% returns on certain limited edition models. That financial incentive pushed manufacturers further away from cheap, work-focused trims. Production of basic models slowed, advertising shifted, and dealerships increasingly stocked the expensive versions because that was where the money was. For a time, the strategy worked brilliantly. Sales soared. Pickup trucks dominated America's best-selling vehicle lists year after year. But this luxurious transformation came with hidden costs. As prices climbed, the gap between the truck's cultural image and its actual purpose widened to the point of contradiction. Trucks were still marketed as tools of the working class, yet the working class could no longer afford them. A fictional analysis by the Western Labor Institute in 2024 estimated that fewer than 28% of full-size pickups sold that year went to buyers earning under $60,000, a stark decline from previous decades. The truck that once symbolized blue-collar resilience had become a trophy of middle-class aspiration and upper-class comfort. The luxury pivot also laid the groundwork for the bubble that would later burst. When a product becomes as emotionally charged and financially inflated as the modern pickup truck, vulnerability creeps in beneath the chrome. Buyers stretch finances to keep up with climbing prices. Lenders loosened standards to maintain volume, and manufacturers kept pushing higher trims because the profits were irresistible. Trucks were no longer being built around the needs of workers. They were being built around the expectations of shareholders and the fantasies of consumers. And while fantasies can fuel record profits, they can also accelerate collapse when reality finally breaks through. By the early 2020s, the financial underpinnings of the pickup truck market had begun to warp under the weight of its own success, even as manufacturers continued to push luxury trims and inflated pricing. Lenders, pressured to keep up with rising vehicle costs and eager to maintain quarterly growth metrics, increasingly approved loans that would have been dismissed outright just a decade earlier. Real-world data already showed loan terms stretching to 7 and even 8 years, but fictional internal memos from the Continental Auto Finance Association in 2024 revealed a more troubling trend. Nearly 37% of approved full-size truck loans were classified as conditional exceptions, meaning buyers failed at least one major underwriting standard. Some borrowers were approved with debt-to-income ratios above 60%, a number once considered unheard of. Yet the loans flowed because the trucks had to keep moving. Dealerships, financed through floor plan loans that used every vehicle on the lot as collateral, were now holding inventories valued at tens of millions of dollars. A single delivery of new trucks, delayed by supply chain disruptions or sudden drops in local sales, could push a dealership's financial ratios to the brink. Managers knew it, bankers knew it, but stopping the machine was unthinkable. As the credit environment loosened, a parallel shift was occurring in how consumers perceived their borrowing power. Many buyers convinced themselves that the steep monthly payments were temporary sacrifices, justified by the projected stability of high resale values and the cultural belief that trucks were almost as solid as real estate. For years, the market reinforced this illusion. Used truck prices surged during supply shortages, reinforcing the idea that trucks were safe purchases. But the combination of inflated new prices and massive overproduction began to erode the foundation of that belief. By mid-2025, trade-in values started slipping. By late 2025, they were falling at a rate that stunned even seasoned analysts. Real-world market swings of 15 to 25% suddenly accelerated, and fictional reports from the Southern Automotive Data Bureau suggested that some regions saw depreciation rates approaching 40% on 2-year-old models. For the first time in memory, the most loyal truck buyers, contractors, farmers, small business owners, found themselves trapped. They owed more than their trucks were worth, and refinancing was no longer possible. Dealers felt the shock first. Because they relied on bank credit lines tied to inventory value, plummeting resale prices wiped out collateral seemingly overnight. A dealership that had looked profitable on paper in spring 2025 could be technically insolvent by the fall. Regional chains began collapsing in waves. Real closures were reported across several states, but fictional local accounts described even more dramatic scenes. Locked gates, yards of unsold trucks collecting dust, and employees showing up to work only to discover the business had shuttered at dawn. Vendors went unpaid. Local towing companies were hired to collect new trucks that banks repossessed from the lots. When manufacturers attempted to stabilize dealers by offering temporary incentives, the support arrived too late to prevent cascading failures. This financial collapse rippled into the daily lives of owners, many of whom had absorbed inflated truck payments under the assumption that their vehicles represented stability. Instead, the trucks became anchors, pulling families underwater. Rising insurance premiums, spikes in maintenance costs for increasingly complex vehicles, and tightening credit markets pushed thousands of households into precarious positions. Financial counseling agencies documented a sharp increase in clients whose highest monthly payment was not their mortgage but their truck loan. A fictional 2026 study from the American Household Stability Forum estimated that in some Midwestern counties, 1 in 8 families considered selling their home or relocating purely to escape truck-related debt. Some did exactly that. News outlets reported genuine cases of individuals living in their trucks for months after losing housing, and fictional local reports described highway rest areas turning into informal communities of truck owners seeking temporary refuge. But the economic fallout was only part of the crisis. As younger generations watched the truck market implode, they began rejecting the cultural meaning that had propped it up for decades. This shift had been building slowly, but the financial meltdown accelerated it dramatically. For Gen Z and younger millennials, the truck came to symbolize the very traits they wished to move away from: excess, inefficiency, and the brittle ideal of hyper-independence. Online culture amplified the sentiment. Viral videos mocked oversized grills and pointless lift kits, while commentators accused older generations of clinging to outdated symbols of strength. A fictional survey from the National Youth Mobility Index in 2026 suggested that only 8% of adults under 30 plan to purchase a full-size truck in the next decade, a staggering decline compared to previous generations. This cultural rejection intensified the perception that the truck market was crumbling not just financially, but ideologically. The object once held up as the embodiment of American resilience now felt out of sync with a country grappling with climate anxiety, urban crowding, rising living costs, and a shifting understanding of masculinity and identity. Trucks no longer aligned with the future many young people envision, one defined by efficiency, sustainability, and flexibility rather than size, noise, and bravado. As resale values dropped and financial institutions grew wary, the truck's symbolic power seemed to drain as well, replaced by a sense of outdated stubbornness. Communities that depended on the truck industry felt this shift acutely. Towns near large dealerships or manufacturing hubs experienced sudden unemployment spikes as closures multiplied. Restaurants, repair shops, landscaping services, and even small construction firms, businesses that had indirectly benefited from the constant churn of truck buying, saw customer traffic collapse. The fictional Midwest Market Sustainability Council reported that in counties heavily dependent on automotive retail, local GDP contracted by as much as 6% during the worst quarters of the downturn. Some towns tried to rally around the idea of revitalizing truck culture, organizing local shows and heritage events, but attendance declined year after year. Younger residents didn't show up, and older ones were increasingly weighed down by debt or job loss. The psychological toll was profound. The pickup truck had long been a vessel through which individuals projected identity, pride, and a sense of belonging. The crash exposed how deeply intertwined people's self-images were with their vehicles. Social workers described clients who felt embarrassed, even ashamed, not simply because of financial trouble, but because the trucks they once saw as symbols of stability had become reminders of misplaced optimism. For others, the loss was more existential. They grappled with the realization that the cultural narrative they had grown up with, the idea that a strong truck equaled a strong life, had unraveled. By 2026, the combined impact of financial fragility, collapsing dealerships, and shifting cultural attitudes reshaped the truck market beyond recognition.